Officer Mark Reynolds had always been the kind of man who took his job seriously. For 15 years he'd worn the badge with pride, patrolling the streets of a busy city where crime never seemed to sleep. He was known for being tough but fair, or at least that's what he told himself. To others, he sometimes came across as gruff or impatient, especially when dealing with people who didn't show him the respect he believed he deserved. On a chilly autumn evening, Mark was driving through a quiet neighborhood when something caught his eye. A sleek black sedan sped past him, clearly going way over the speed limit. Without hesitation, he flicked on his sirens and pulled the car over. As he approached the driver's side window, he noticed the person behind the wheel, a woman in her late 30s with sharp features and an air of confidence. She wore a tailored blazer, and her hair was neatly styled, making her look more like someone heading to a boardroom than cruising down a residential street. "License and registration, please," Mark said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. The woman handed over her documents without argument. Her name was Clara Bennett, according to the ID. While Mark jotted down her information, she glanced up at him. "Officer," she began calmly, "do you mind telling me why I was pulled over? I wasn't aware I was speeding." Mark raised an eyebrow. People often tried to play innocent after getting caught, but there was something about Clara's tone that rubbed him the wrong way. It wasn't defiant, it was almost too polite, like she thought she could charm her way out of trouble. "I clocked you at 45 in a 25 zone, he replied curtly. "That's reckless driving, ma'am." Clara nodded slowly, processing his words. "I see. But if I may ask, have there been any recent accidents or complaints about speeding in this area? Or is this more of a revenue-generating exercise?" Mark stiffened. Revenue-generating? He hated when people implied that cops were just out to write tickets for fun. "Ma'am, my job is to enforce the law," he said, his tone sharpening. "If you don't want a ticket, maybe you shouldn't break it." Clara tilted her head, slightly studying him. "Of course. I'm not arguing against following the rules. I'm simply curious about the priorities here." There was no anger in her voice, only calm curiosity, but to Mark it felt condescending, like she thought she knew better than him. "You know what?" he snapped, leaning closer to the window. "Some people think they're above the law because they wear fancy clothes or drive expensive cars. But let me tell you something. You're not special. The rules apply to everyone, including you." For a moment, Clara looked taken aback. Then she smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for reminding me, officer. Have a good night." Mark finished writing the ticket and handed it back to her, his jaw tight. As he walked back to his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd somehow lost the upper hand in their exchange. Clara drove off quietly, leaving him standing alone under the dim glow of a street lamp. Later that night, as Mark sat in his cruiser filling out paperwork, he replayed the encounter in his head. Why had she gotten under his skin so much? Maybe it was the way she spoke, so measured, so composed, as if she were analyzing him instead of fearing him. Or maybe it was the tiny flicker of amusement he'd seen in her eyes when he lectured her. Whatever it was, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. What Mark didn't realize, and what Clara hadn't mentioned, was that she wasn't just some ordinary citizen. In fact, she was days away from stepping into one of the most powerful roles in the state, the Attorney General. Clara had spent years climbing the ranks of the legal system, earning a reputation as a brilliant and relentless advocate for justice. And while she understood the importance of respecting authority, she also knew how easily power could corrupt those who wielded it. As she drove home that night, Clara couldn't help but reflect on the traffic stop. She'd encountered officers, like Mark before, men and women who let their egos get in the way of fairness. Still, she made a mental note of his name and badge number. If nothing else, it would be interesting to see how fate might bring them together again. Little did either of them know, their paths were destined to cross once more, not on a darkened street, but in a courtroom where the stakes would be much higher. For now, though, both went about their lives unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. Mark continued his patrols, convinced he'd done nothing wrong, while Clara prepared for the responsibilities of her new position. determined to make a difference in a world that often favored the privileged few. And so, the stage was set for an unexpected confrontation, one that would challenge everything Mark thought he knew about himself and force him to confront the consequences of his actions. Weeks passed since the traffic stop, and Officer Mark Reynolds had all but forgotten about the encounter with Clara Bennett. Life on the force was busy as ever, filled with long shifts, endless paperwork, and the occasional adrenaline rush of chasing down leads or responding to emergencies. To him, the speeding ticket he'd issued that night was just another routine task, a small blip in the grand scheme of things. But fate has a way of circling back when you least expect it. One morning, Mark received a summons to appear in court as part of a routine hearing for one of his recent cases. It wasn't unusual for officers to testify in court. It came with the territory of enforcing laws. This particular case involved a minor traffic violation, and Mark assumed it would be quick and straightforward. He arrived at the courthouse dressed in his crisp uniform, ready to fulfill his duty without giving it much thought. As he entered the courtroom, Mark scanned the room out of habit. His eyes landed on the defendant's table, and suddenly, his stomach dropped. Sitting there looking as composed as ever was none other than Clara Bennett, the same woman from the traffic stop weeks ago. For a brief moment, Mark felt a flicker of unease, though he quickly brushed it off. After all, what were the chances she'd remember him? And even if she did, this was his turf now, a place where justice was served according to the rules. But something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed different today. Instead of the usual bustling energy, there was an air of quiet anticipation. The bailiff moved around with unusual efficiency, and several people in the gallery whispered among themselves, glancing toward the front of the room. Mark noticed how everyone treated Clara with a level of respect that seemed disproportionate for someone facing a simple traffic violation. Before he could dwell on it further, the judge entered and the proceedings began. As the case unfolded, Mark realized something strange. Clara wasn't acting like a defendant. She wasn't fidgeting nervously or anxiously waiting for her turn to speak. Instead, she stood confidently beside the prosecutor's table, consulting notes and exchanging calm remarks with the legal team. At first, Mark thought maybe she was working as some sort of paralegal or assistant. But then the judge addressed her directly. "Ms. Bennett," the judge said, nodding respectfully, "would you care to present your opening statement?" Mark's jaw nearly hit the floor. Opening statement? What was going on here? He watched in stunned silence as Clara stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding attention. With poise and precision, she began outlining the details of the case, not as the accused but as the prosecuting attorney. Every word she spoke carried authority, and the courtroom hung on her every sentence. And then came the bombshell. Midway through her presentation, Clara paused and turned to address the gallery. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I'd like to inform the court that I have recently been appointed as the interim Attorney General of the state." The room erupted into murmurs. Even the judge looked momentarily surprised before regaining composure. Mark, however, felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Attorney General? The very title sent a chill down his spine. In an instant, everything clicked into place. The deference from the bailiff, the whispers in the gallery, the unshakable confidence Clara exuded. She wasn't just any lawyer. She was one of the most powerful figures in the entire legal system, responsible for overseeing cases involving law enforcement officers, including ones like himself. For Mark, the realization was crushing. All the bravado he'd displayed during their traffic stop now felt embarrassingly misplaced. He remembered how dismissive he'd been with her, how he'd let his pride get the better of him. Worst of all, he knew she hadn't forgotten. Not for a second. Clara resumed her argument, laying out the facts of the case with razor-sharp clarity. When it came time for Officer Reynolds to take the stand, Mark felt like he was walking into a lion's den. Every step toward the witness box felt heavier than the last. As he swore to tell the truth, his eyes darted toward Clara, who regarded him with a neutral expression. There was no malice in her gaze, but neither was there warmth. She was completely professional, treating him as she would any other witness. Under her questioning, Mark found himself struggling to keep his composure. Clara's questions weren't aggressive or confrontational. They were methodical, almost clinical. Yet each one seemed designed to expose flaws in his conduct. She asked him to recount the events of the traffic stop, probing gently but persistently until inconsistencies in his account emerged. "Officer Reynolds," Clara began at one point, her tone measured. "You mentioned in your report that Ms. Bennett appeared uncooperative. Could you elaborate on that?" Mark hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Well, she questioned my authority," he stammered. "She kept asking me why I pulled her over, like she didn't believe I had a good reason." "I see," Clara replied, nodding thoughtfully. "So seeking clarification about the reason for a traffic stop is considered uncooperative behavior in your experience?" "No, not necessarily," Mark backtracked, feeling the heat rising in his cheeks. "But the way she said it came across as disrespectful." "Disrespectful how?" Clara pressed, her voice still calm but firm. "Did she raise her voice? Use inappropriate language? Or did she simply express disagreement with your assessment?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He couldn't deny that Clara had remained polite throughout their interaction. The problem wasn't what she'd said, it was how she'd made him feel. Exposed, challenged, like he wasn't the authority figure he believed himself to be. As the questioning continued, Mark became increasingly flustered. Clara presented evidence showing similar complaints against him from past incidents, citizens who had reported feeling belittled or intimidated during encounters with him. Witnesses took the stand, recounting moments when his demeanor had crossed the line from assertive to abrasive. By the time Clara concluded her cross-examination, the portrait she'd painted of Mark was damning. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Mark couldn't bring himself to resent Clara. There was no gloating in her approach, no attempt to humiliate him for personal satisfaction. She was doing her job, holding him accountable in the same way she would anyone else in his position. And deep down, Mark knew she was right. His ego had clouded his judgment that night, leading him to treat her unfairly. By the end of the session, the courtroom was abuzz with murmurs. Mark sat slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily on his shoulders. For the first time in his career, he felt truly humbled. What started as a routine court appearance had turned into a reckoning, one that forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the power dynamics at play in his profession. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered, eager to capture reactions from those involved in the high-profile case. But Mark slipped away unnoticed, desperate to escape the spotlight. As he walked to his car, his mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. Would Clara pursue disciplinary action against him? Had he jeopardized his career with his own arrogance? Unbeknownst to Mark, Clara wasn't interested in revenge. Her goal had never been to punish him, but to shine a light on the systemic issues within law enforcement. Still, the road ahead wouldn't be easy, for either of them. Both were about to embark on a journey of reflection, accountability, and ultimately transformation. The courtroom had emptied, save for a few lingering court staff tidying up papers and straightening chairs. Mark sat on a bench in the hallway outside, his head in his hands. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like a physical force. For someone who prided himself on being strong and unshakable, this moment felt unbearable. His mind replayed every word Clara had said during the hearing, calm, measured, yet cutting to the core. Each question she'd asked wasn't just about the traffic stop. It was about patterns. Patterns that he hadn't even realized existed until they were laid bare before him. Clara emerged from the courtroom moments later, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She paused when she saw Mark sitting there, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. For a brief second, she hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk away, leave him to process everything on his own. After all, he'd brought this upon himself with his dismissive attitude and unchecked ego. But another part of her, a quieter, more empathetic part, knew that walking away wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would reinforce the very divide between law enforcement and civilians that she had dedicated her career to bridging. She approached him slowly, her presence deliberate but not intimidating. "Officer Reynolds," she said quietly, her voice steady but softer than it had been in the courtroom. Mark looked up, startled. He hadn't expected her to acknowledge him after everything that had transpired. "Ms. Bennett," he mumbled, struggling to find the right words. I'm sorry." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was no anger in her expression, only curiosity. "Sorry for what exactly?" she asked, taking a seat beside him on the bench. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. "For how I treated you that night, for assuming things about you, for letting my pride get in the way." He shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. "I didn't know who you were then, but even if I had, it shouldn't have mattered. You deserve respect, whether you're the Attorney General or just anyone else." Clara nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "You're right," she said after a pause. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Everyone deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of their title or status. But let me ask you something, Officer Reynolds. Do you think your behavior that night was unique to me? Or is it possible you've treated others the same way?" Mark winced at the question. It was one thing to admit fault for a specific incident. It was another entirely to confront the possibility that his actions might reflect deeper issues. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe. Probably. I never meant to belittle anyone, but sometimes I guess I let my frustrations get the better of me." Clara leaned back slightly, her gaze thoughtful. "It's easy to justify our behavior when we're under pressure. We tell ourselves we're doing the right thing, protecting people, enforcing the law. But when does enforcing the law turn into wielding power? When does authority become arrogance?" Her words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. She wasn't accusing him directly, but her questions forced him to see himself through a lens he'd avoided for years. He thought back to countless interactions over his 15-year career. Drivers who argued with him, pedestrians who challenged his decisions, suspects who refused to comply. How many times had he responded with impatience or irritation? How many times had he dismissed someone because they dared to question him? "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said finally, his voice cracking. I wanted to do my job, to keep people safe." "I believe you," Clara replied gently, "but wanting to do good isn't enough. Intentions mean nothing without accountability. You have power, Officer Reynolds, not just because of your badge, but because of how people perceive you. And with that power comes responsibility." Mark nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. He'd always seen himself as the good guy, the protector. Now, for the first time, he saw the cracks in that image. Cracks formed by complacency, pride, and a failure to listen. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How do I fix this?" Clara studied him for a long moment, weighing her response. "That's up to you," she said finally. "No one can change except the person who wants to. But if you're serious about making things right, start by listening. Listen to the people you serve, listen to your colleagues, and most importantly, listen to yourself. Understand why you react the way you do. Only then can you begin to change." Mark wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, nodding again. "I'll try," he promised. "I don't want to be the kind of person who makes others feel small, not anymore." Clara offered him a small, encouraging smile. "Good. That's a start." Later that evening, Mark returned home, his mind still reeling. From the conversation, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the darkened streets beyond. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. He thought about Clara's words and how they echoed truths he'd ignored for far too long. He picked up his phone and scrolled through old messages from colleagues and friends. Over the years, he'd brushed off their occasional comments about his temper or his tendency to dominate conversations. "You're just passionate," they'd say. "You care too much." But now, those excuses sounded hollow. Passion wasn't an excuse for cruelty. Caring too much didn't justify making others feel less than human. Determined to take action, Mark decided to reach out to an old mentor from his early days on the force. Sergeant Harris had always been a voice of reason, someone who balanced toughness with compassion. They hadn't spoken in years, but Mark knew he could trust him to give honest advice. "Harris," Mark said when the older man answered the phone. "It's Reynolds. Look, I need your help." There was a pause on the other end. "Reynolds, what's going on?" Mark hesitated, unsure how to explain everything that had happened. "I messed up, Harris, big time, and I need to figure out how to make it right." Sergeant Harris chuckled softly. "Sounds like you're finally ready to grow up, kid. Tell me what's going on." Over the next hour, Mark poured out his heart, recounting the traffic stop, the courtroom hearing, and his conversation with Clara. Harris listened patiently, offering guidance and sharing stories from his own experiences. By the end of the call, Mark felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. The next day, Mark took the first step toward change. He enrolled in a sensitivity training program designed for law enforcement officers. The classes weren't mandatory, but he attended them anyway, determined to learn new ways of interacting with the public. At first, he found it difficult to open up in front of strangers, especially when discussing his past mistakes. But as the weeks went by, he began to see the value in vulnerability. Listening to others share their struggles reminded him that he wasn't alone, and that everyone had room to improve. Word of Mark's efforts spread quickly within the department. Some of his colleagues teased him, calling him soft or questioning his motives. But others respected his decision, recognizing the courage it took to confront his flaws head-on. Among them was Captain Morales, who pulled Mark aside one afternoon. "Reynolds," Morales said, crossing his arms, "I heard you've been hitting the books pretty hard lately. What's gotten into you?" Mark shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just trying to be better, sir. For myself and for the people we serve." Morales studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good. Keep it up. The world needs more cops willing to look in the mirror." As the months passed, Mark continued to work on himself. He sought feedback from the community, attending town hall meetings and engaging in conversations with residents. He learned to listen without interrupting, to apologize when he was wrong, and to approach every interaction with humility rather than superiority. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, but he persevered, driven by the knowledge that real change required effort. And while Mark worked on becoming a better version of himself, Clara kept tabs on his progress from afar. Though their paths didn't cross often, she occasionally received updates from mutual acquaintances in the legal system. Each report painted a picture of an officer striving to improve, not for accolades or redemption, but because he genuinely believed in the importance of fairness and respect. One afternoon, Clara received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the ink smudged in places where Mark had pressed too hard with his pen. In it, he thanked her for holding him accountable and assured her that he was committed to learning from his mistakes. He ended the note with a simple sentence, "I hope someday I can earn your trust." Clara read the letter twice, a faint smile playing on her lips. Trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight, but Mark's willingness to try was a promising sign. She tucked the letter into a drawer, resolving to keep it as a reminder of the potential for growth, even in the unlikeliest of places. Though their journeys remained separate, both Mark and Clara understood that true justice wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about creating opportunities for understanding, healing, and transformation, and in their own ways they were working toward that goal, one step at a time. Months had passed since that fateful courtroom encounter, and Officer Mark Reynolds was a changed man, or at least he was trying to be. The sensitivity training program he'd enrolled in wasn't just a box-ticking exercise for him anymore. It became a cornerstone of his daily life. He attended workshops on de-escalation techniques, bias awareness, and community engagement. At first, the sessions felt like a challenge. Admitting fault in front of strangers didn't come naturally to someone who had spent years asserting authority. But as time went on, Mark began to see these meetings not as punishments but as opportunities. One evening, after a particularly eye-opening session about implicit bias, Mark found himself sitting alone in his car outside the community center, where the class was held. His mind raced with thoughts of all the interactions he'd mishandled over the years, the drivers he'd intimidated, the pedestrians he'd dismissed, the suspects he'd treated more harshly than necessary. It was overwhelming, almost paralyzing, to think about how much harm one person could unintentionally cause. But then he remembered something Clara Bennett had said during their conversation in the courthouse hallway. No one can change except the person who wants to. Those words echoed in his mind now, giving him strength. He couldn't undo the past, but he could work toward a better future. For himself, for his colleagues, and for the people he served. Mark's transformation didn't go unnoticed within the department. Some officers teased him behind his back, calling him Sensitive Sam, or joking that he'd gone soft. Others were genuinely curious, asking him why he was putting so much effort into what they considered optional training. To those who asked, sincerely, Mark explained his reasoning without hesitation. It's not about being soft, he told them during one lunch break. It's about being smarter. We're here to protect people, right? Well, you can't do that if they don't trust you, and trust isn't earned by throwing your weight around. It's earned by listening and showing respect. Not everyone agreed with him, but some did, and that was enough to keep him motivated. Slowly but surely, Mark started influencing those around him. He volunteered to lead discussions during roll call about improving public relations and encouraged younger officers to attend the same training programs he had. His superiors took note of his efforts too. Captain Morales, impressed by Mark's dedication, assigned him to mentor rookies fresh out of the academy. At first, mentoring felt daunting. These new recruits looked up to him as an example of what it meant to be a seasoned officer. How could he teach them when he still felt like he had so much to learn himself? But Mark realized that sharing his journey was part of the process. During one-on-one sessions, he opened up about his mistakes, not just the traffic stop with Clara, but other moments where his actions had fallen short. I'm not perfect, he admitted to a young rookie named Jessica during one such session. And neither are you. But we have a choice. We can either ignore our flaws or face them head-on. Trust me, facing them is harder, but it's worth it. Jessica nodded thoughtfully, her eyes wide. Do you think I'll ever mess up like that? She asked hesitantly. You will, Mark replied with a small smile. We all do. What matters is what you do afterward. Do you double down, or do you try to make things right? His honesty resonated with the rookies, many of whom began approaching him with questions and concerns they might not have voiced otherwise. Over time, Mark became known less as the gruff veteran and more as the approachable mentor, a role he never imagined he'd embrace. Meanwhile, Clara Bennett continued her work as the Attorney General, championing reforms aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Her office launched initiatives to address systemic issues within policing, including mandatory training programs similar to the ones Mark had attended. She also pushed for policies that promoted transparency and accountability, ensuring that officers who abused their power faced consequences, while those striving to improve received support. Though Clara stayed focused on her broader goals, she occasionally thought about Mark. Word had reached her through mutual contacts about his progress, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. Accountability wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about creating pathways for redemption. If Mark's transformation proved genuine, it could serve as a powerful example for others in law enforcement. One day, Clara decided to reach out to him directly. She sent a formal invitation to meet at her office under the pretense of discussing ongoing reform efforts. When Mark arrived dressed in his uniform and visibly nervous, Clara greeted him warmly. "Officer Reynolds," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming." Mark shook her hand firmly, though his palms were sweaty. "Ms. Bennett," he replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me." They sat down across from each other in her spacious yet unpretentious office. Clara wasted no time getting to the point. "I've heard good things about the changes you've been making," she began. "From what I understand, you've taken significant steps to improve both personally and professionally." Mark nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "I've tried," he said honestly. "It hasn't been easy, but it's necessary." Clara leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Change rarely is easy, but it's inspiring to see someone willing to put in the work. Tell me, what inspired you to take this path?" Mark hesitated, searching for the right words. "You," he admitted finally. "That night in court, you made me see myself differently. Not just as an officer, but as a person. I realized I wasn't living up to the standards I claimed to believe in." Clara studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "That takes courage, to look inward and admit fault. Many people aren't capable of doing that." "I wouldn't have done it without you pushing me," Mark said earnestly. "And I know saying sorry doesn't fix everything, but I want you to know I'm committed to making a difference, not just for myself, but for others." Clara nodded approvingly. "That's what true leadership looks like. It's not about titles or positions. It's about action, about setting an example for others to follow." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from specific policy proposals to personal anecdotes about challenges they'd faced in their respective roles. By the end of the meeting, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. Clara hadn't absolved him of his past mistakes, nor had she offered empty praise. Instead, she'd acknowledged his efforts while reminding him that the journey was far from over. Before he left, Clara handed him a folder containing materials related to upcoming reform initiatives. "Consider this an opportunity to contribute," she said. "Your perspective, as someone who's experienced both sides of the issue, could be invaluable." Mark accepted the folder gratefully, his chest swelling with determination. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, not just for himself but for the possibility of meaningful change within the system. In the weeks that followed, Mark threw himself into the initiatives Clara had shared with him. He collaborated with community leaders, participated in panel discussions, and even wrote articles for the department newsletter highlighting the importance of empathy and accountability in policing. His reputation grew beyond the confines of his precinct, earning him recognition as a vocal advocate for reform. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of his journey was seeing its impact on those around him. Rookies like Jessica approached him with newfound confidence, eager to share their own ideas for fostering positive relationships with the public. Veteran officers, once skeptical of his methods, began adopting some of his practices, realizing that compassion didn't diminish authority, it enhanced it. Through it all, Mark remained mindful of the lessons he'd learned. He knew he wasn't perfect and likely never would be. But perfection wasn't the goal. Growth was. And as long as he kept striving to be better, for himself and for others, he knew he was heading in the right direction. As for Clara, she watched, from afar, proud of the ripple effect Mark's transformation had created. Though their paths remained separate, they were united by a shared vision, a world where justice wasn't just a concept, but a lived reality for everyone. Over time, Mark Reynolds became a symbol of change, not just within his department but across the state. His journey from a brash, unyielding officer to someone striving for accountability and empathy resonated deeply with both law enforcement and civilians alike. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor was it free of challenges, but Mark's persistence inspired others to reflect on their own actions. People began to see him not as the man who had made a mistake, but as proof that even those in positions of authority could grow and evolve. Clara Bennett played a pivotal role in amplifying Mark's story without ever seeking credit for herself. As Attorney General, she understood the power of narratives, how they could shape public perception and drive systemic reform. During press conferences and interviews, she subtly highlighted examples of officers like Mark who were taking steps toward meaningful change. She avoided naming him directly, instead framing his efforts as part of a larger movement aimed at rebuilding trust between police forces and the communities they served. The ripple effects of this dual effort were undeniable. Other officers, inspired by Mark's example, started participating in community outreach programs, attending town hall meetings, and engaging in open dialogues with residents. Some departments implemented peer mentoring systems modeled after Mark's work with rookies, fostering environments where vulnerability and growth weren't seen as weaknesses but as strengths. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Not everywhere, and certainly not all at once, but enough to plant seeds of hope. One chilly spring morning, Mark received a call from Clara's office inviting him to speak at a statewide conference on policing reform. The event brought together law enforcement officials, policymakers, activists, and community leaders, all united by a shared desire to create a fairer, more equitable system. At first, Mark hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the thought of addressing such a diverse audience intimidated him. But Clara assured him that his presence would make a difference. "People need to hear your story," she told him over the phone. "Not because it's unique, but because it's possible. You're living proof that change is achievable." Encouraged by her words, Mark agreed. He spent days preparing his speech, carefully choosing anecdotes that illustrated his journey while emphasizing the importance of humility, self-reflection, and collaboration. When the day of the conference arrived, he stood backstage, clutching his notes and trying to calm his nerves. Through the curtain, he could see hundreds of faces staring expectantly at the stage. As he walked onto the platform, applause erupted throughout the room. For a moment, Mark froze, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Then he took a deep breath, stepped up to the microphone, and began to speak. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," he admitted early in his speech. "I don't. What I can do is share my experience in the hope that it might help someone else avoid the mistakes I made, or give them the courage to face them if they've already happened." He recounted the traffic stop with Clara, describing how his pride and preconceived notions had blinded him to her humanity. He spoke candidly about the courtroom hearing that shattered his illusions of infallibility and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. And he detailed the hard work that followed, the training sessions, the difficult conversations, the moments of doubt and frustration. "But here's the thing," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "None of us are perfect. We'll stumble, we'll fall, and sometimes we'll hurt people despite our best intentions. That doesn't mean we should stop trying. It means we should try harder." By the end of his speech, the room was silent except for the sound of scattered sniffles and murmurs of agreement. When Mark finished, the audience rose to their feet, applauding thunderously. Even Clara, seated near the front row, joined in, her expression one of quiet pride. Afterward, dozens of attendees approached Mark to shake his hand or thank him for sharing his story. Among them was a young patrol officer named Marcus, whose earnest demeanor reminded Mark of himself years ago. "Sir," Marcus said nervously, "I just wanted to say, hearing you talk today gave me hope. I've been struggling with some of the same issues you mentioned. I didn't think anyone else felt this way." Mark placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're not alone," he replied, "and neither am I. None of us are. That's why we have to keep supporting each other and holding each other accountable." In the months that followed, Mark continued to build on the momentum sparked by the conference. He partnered with Clara's office to develop workshops tailored specifically for law enforcement agencies looking to implement reforms. These sessions combined practical skills training with candid discussions about privilege, bias, and power dynamics. Officers who attended often described the experience as transformative, crediting Mark's openness and authenticity for helping them feel less defensive and more willing to engage. Clara, meanwhile, used her position to advocate for policies that supported these grassroots efforts. She pushed for increased funding for mental health resources for officers, recognizing the toll that stress and trauma could take on their ability to connect with the public. She also championed legislation requiring independent oversight boards to review cases of alleged misconduct, ensuring transparency and fairness in disciplinary processes. Though their roles remained distinct, one as a frontline officer, the other as a high-ranking official, Mark and Clara developed a mutual respect that transcended their initial encounter. They occasionally met for coffee or lunch, exchanging ideas and updates on their respective initiatives. Their conversations were always productive, marked by a shared commitment to justice and equality. "You know," Clara remarked during one such meeting, "when I first met you that night in court, I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me thought you'd dig your heels in and refuse to acknowledge any wrongdoing." Mark chuckled softly. "I almost did," he admitted. "But something about the way you handled things made me realize I had no choice. Running away from the truth wouldn't fix anything." "And now?" Clara asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. "Now?" Mark echoed, smiling. "Now I know there's still so much work to be done. But I also know I'm not doing it alone. That makes all the difference." Years later, when historians looked back on this period of reform, they cited figures like Clara Bennett and Mark Reynolds as catalysts for lasting change. While Clara's leadership provided the framework for progress, Mark's personal journey demonstrated its potential impact on individuals and institutions alike. Together, they proved that true transformation required not just policy changes, but shifts in mindset, a willingness to listen, learn, and adapt. For Mark, the legacy of his journey wasn't measured in awards or accolades, but in the relationships he rebuilt and the lives he touched along the way. Whether mentoring rookies, collaborating with community leaders, or simply treating every interaction with patience and respect, he embodied the principles he once struggled to embrace. As for Clara, she knew her work would never truly be finished. Justice was a constant pursuit requiring vigilance and perseverance. Yet moments like this, when unlikely allies came together to challenge the status quo, reminded her why she chose this path in the first place. In the end, their story wasn't just about redemption or reform. It was about connection, about two people from vastly different worlds finding common ground and using it to inspire others. And though their paths diverged as time went on, the bond they forged endured, a testament to the power of humility, accountability, and the belief that everyone deserves a second chance.